Michael Jordan was the world's greatest athlete. Macaulay Culkin was living every kid's dream.
How convenient. Guys, I'm eating junk and watching rubbish.
And the M in MTV stood for music. Yep, it was the 90s. Those were the days. If you're a 90s kid, you'll remember these 15 things that defined our generation. Number 1. Seinfeld. Seinfeld premiered in 1989, but it largely defined the 90s sitcom. It was a show about nothing that revolved around ordinary people's ridiculous adventures, but somehow was also the most relatable show on TV, and it still is. Seinfeld produced the coffee table book about coffee tables, and catchphrases like,
"Hello, Newman."
Serenity now! Serenity now!
and of course, Number 2. Another product of the 80s that came to prominence in the 90s was The Simpsons. Bart Simpson was featured in Butterfinger commercials for a time,
Nobody better lay a finger on my Butterfinger.
and Homer Simpson had a few run-ins with Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. The Simpsons parodies every facet of modern American life, and going into season 32 in fall 2020, it shows no sign of slowing down. Number 3. Nickelodeon defined kids' TV programming for a whole decade, and they just don't make shows like that anymore. All That was a sketch comedy series with the same format as Saturday Night Live but targeted towards kids, and Kenan and Kel was an All That spinoff. Are You Afraid of the Dark? Legends of the Hidden Temple, Clarissa Explains It All, Salute Your Shorts,
Hey, dude.
and The Adventures of Pete and Pete, among many others. They touched on every aspect of kids' lives in the 90s and reached cult classic status among the fanbase they were popular with. Number 4. Pogs. Obviously, Pogs was going to make it on this list. The game of Pogs started in Hawaii as milk caps in 1991, before spreading to the western United States and taking the rest of the world by fire by 1994. There were Pogs for everything. X-Men, Coke, and Power Rangers all had their own Pogs. Milhouse even traded Bart Simpson's soul for a set of Alf Pogs.
I got some cool Pogs. Elf Pogs. You traded my soul for Pogs?
Number 5. The Persian Gulf War. Saddam Hussein became a prominent international figure in the 90s after the Gulf War. If you grew up in the 90s, the Gulf War was probably among the first international conflicts you remember. Even after his defeat, Saddam Hussein remained in the headlines through the 90s with UN weapons inspectors and Iraq's attempts at developing weapons of mass destruction. Number 6. McDonald's Supersize. Everyone is familiar with the concept of small, medium, large. Most of us hang out around medium. But in the early 90s, McDonald's offered the option to supersize a meal, essentially a fourth size in the small, medium, large catalog. The Supersize Me fad lasted through the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, when it was highlighted by the independent film Supersize Me. Number 7. The LA Riots. If you grew up in the 90s, the name Rodney King rings more than a few bells. Namely, a traffic stop in the San Fernando Valley on March 3, 1992. 5 officers were charged with using excessive force and acquitted of charges during a jury trial. The riots came swiftly after the verdict was given and lasted for 6 days, resulting in more than 60 deaths, more than 2,000 injured, and over $1 billion in damages. The LA riots of 1992 highlighted racial tensions in the United States and were precursors to the modern Black Lives Matter movement. Number 8. The Mighty Ducks. If you grew up in the 90s, the Mighty Ducks brought hockey into the limelight. It's a movie about an inner-city hockey team that pulls themselves together under the guidance of a coach sentenced to community service for drunk driving. The Anaheim Ducks took their name from the film, which also spawned 2 sequels in 1994 and 1996, with the tags D2, The Mighty Ducks, and D3, The Mighty Ducks. Number 9. The Sandlot. If you grew up in the 90s, the phrase
Killing me, Smalls.
still rolls off your tongue, and you continue to wonder about s'mores.
I haven't had anything yet, so how can I have some more of nothing?
The Sandlot centered around a group of young baseball players in the 1960s, but it was really a story about friendship and just hanging out. Number 10. Goosebumps. R.L. Stine wrote 62 horror books in the Goosebumps series. If you grew up in the 90s, titles like Cuckoo Clock of Doom, Night of the Living Dummy, and Say Cheese and Die are still some of the best horror fiction ever written. It remains among the best book series ever told. Number 12. The OJ Simpson Trial. The OJ Simpson Trial was the most publicized criminal trial at the time and has been called the trial of the century. Former NFL running back OJ Simpson, aka the Juice, accused of murdering his wife and her friend, was arrested following a low-speed chase on the Santa Ana freeway. OJ was found not guilty on October 3rd, and everyone remembers the infamous glove that didn't fit. If you grew up in the 90s, you probably remember where you were and how you felt when you heard the not guilty verdict. Even 25 years later, the verdict is a major talking point even among people too young to remember the trial. Number 13. The Oklahoma City bombing. If you grew up in the 90s, the first terrorist attack you remember is probably the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995. It was the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil until September 11, 2001, and remains the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in American history. The attack on the Oklahoma City federal building that resulted in 168 deaths was perpetrated by anti-government militant Timothy McVeigh with a truck full of explosives. McVeigh was found guilty of 11 counts of murder and conspiracy in 1997. Number 14. Blockbuster. Before Netflix or Amazon, if you wanted to rent movies, you had to go to the movie store. It might sound like a hassle, but in the 90s, hanging out at Blockbuster and picking out a few movies for the weekend was a lot of fun on a Friday night. Number 15. Magic Eye. Everyone lied about being able to see the picture in the Magic Eye books at least once. Sometimes you could see the picture, but you didn't know how you did it. Other times you'd get tips on how to unfocus your eye to see it, and it didn't work. But once you got it down, these books were so cool. Do you agree with my list? What do you remember from the 90s? Please let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that little bell in the corner to get notifications on more videos like this one.